So, hi everyone, I'm Tiffany with the Friends of Haystack Rock. I want to thank you guys for all coming to our lecture tonight. We are happy to be partnering with the Friends of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. Their program director is Kristen. She's been with them for a short time, but is doing an excellent job. And she will be introducing the speakers tonight, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, I'm going to get my screen share going. All right, good evening everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kristen Banz, and I am the program coordinator for the Friends of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. And I am really happy that you're joining us tonight. Thank you so much. My contact information is on the screen, and I invite you please to visit our website and our social media to find out more about marine reserves and also more about our programming. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to dive in a little bit about Oregon's marine reserves. So Oregon has 5 different marine reserves, and they are managed by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The reserves were 10 years in the making, and we are coming up on our anniversary very soon. And we have a review that is coming up also in 2023. So if you haven't visited a marine reserve, please come out to the coast. You have several different options up and down the coast. We'd love to have you. The goals of the reserves are to conserve biodiversity and habitat, as well as to serve as sites that are living laboratories for scientific research, both formal and research that is community driven. So for instance, working with partners like Portland Audubon to run brown pelican surveys. Cape Falcon Marine Reserve is the northerlymost reserve on the coast. We are situated between Arch Cape and Manzanita. We're also one of the youngest reserves, with restrictions starting in 2016. Each marine reserve is different in flavor. So we are different sizes, different shapes. We also have different types of animals and creatures that you can find within our spaces, and different activities that you can do within the spaces as well. The reserves have 2 different designations. The red area that you see on your screen is our marine reserve proper, and that space is one in which no take is allowed. So you can't take any animals from the space, any seaweeds. Everything has to stay in the ocean. All the goods stay in the ocean. Also, there's no development within the space allowed either. Now, abutting these marine reserve spaces often have 2 marine protected areas. And with Cape Falcon, we have a shoreside marine protected area that's located around Cape Falcon, which is right below Arch Cape. And in the shoreside marine reserve, we have some take that is allowed. So the difference between a marine reserve and a marine protected area generally is that marine protected areas allow for some take. In the case of our shoreside reserve, you can do angling from that space. We have a western marine protected area as well, and it is near the edge of our 3 nautical mile line out into the ocean. So all reserves go out 3 nautical miles into the ocean. In our western reserve, in that space, you can do salmon you can take salmon, and also you can do crab by trolling. Most of the habitat that we have is soft bottom, so it's ripe for these type of critters to live in. The organization in which I work for, the Friends of Cape Falcon, assists the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to do education and outreach initiatives. And the main goal for this is to foster a deeper connection and create meaning-making experiences for people like you and I, so we can ensure that these spaces are protected for future generations. Some of the partners that we work with on a regular basis, their logos are on the screen. Our fiscal sponsor is the Lower Nehalem Community Trust. And tonight we are partnering with the Friends of Haystack Rock to provide this lecture. Now, We entered into this partnership with the Friends of Haystack Rock and reached out to our speakers tonight because the idea of blue carbon is something that is, researchers are tackling this idea as it relates to coastal and marine ecosystems kind of across the world. And they are grappling with questions about, can blue carbon have a major impact on climate change in marine reserves, in estuary sites, in coastal ecosystems? And so we reached out to Pew to see, can you talk a little bit more about what this means? What does blue carbon, or the storing of carbon, mean for these spaces? So tonight's talk, Oregon's blue carbon policy, where we are and what's next. Our presenters will share a bit about blue carbon and explain the Oregon Global Warming Commission's adoption of the first ever natural and working lands proposal. We're going to talk about how to get more involved in that information, and also tease out emerging research to broaden the blue carbon conversation. Our speakers tonight are Bobby Hayden. He is the Associate Manager of Conserving Marine Life in the United States through the Pew Charitable Trusts. Bobby Hayden engages communities to conserve ocean and coastal resources on the western United States coast. Before joining Pew, Hayden worked as a community organizing and communications for more than a decade. As the Solutions, Stories, and Media Manager with Climate Solutions, he worked to identify and engage new audiences for climate and clean energy campaigns throughout the Northwest. He also spent several years as the national representative for the Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition, mobilizing support to restore the Columbia Snake River Basin, which has some of the world's best habitat for sustaining wild and steelhead salmon. Joining him tonight is Jasmine D'Agostino, Program Associate, Conserving Marine Life in the United States, Pew Charitable Trust's Ray Diversity Fellow. Jasmine works to leverage blue carbon accounting in state greenhouse gas inventories as a way to increase protections for coastal and marine habitats along the west and east coast of the United States. She grew up in both Veracruz, Mexico, and Washington State. Her passion for marine conservation led her to pursue a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology at the University of Hawaii. While in Hawaii, she gained experience in marine research of intertidal communities and squid through working for the Koelu Basin Marine Laboratory and our project in Hawaii's Intertidal. She also volunteered as a marine educator for the Waikiki Aquarium. That's all I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Bobby and Jasmine. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, can everybody hear me? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Thank you for having us today. My name is Jasmine, and I'm here with my colleague Bobby from the Pew Charitable Trust, and today we'll be presenting on protecting blue carbon habitats in Oregon. So a little bit more about my background. As Kristen said, I graduated from the University of Hawaii with a Bachelor's of Science in Marine Biology. And I recently moved to Oregon to work with the Pew Charitable Trust in their Conserving Marine Life in the US program. I arrived at Pew as a Roger R. Leonard Young Fellow, and the Ray Fellowship connects diverse young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds to the field of conservation. So since arriving at Pew, I have began working on advancing blue carbon efforts nationally. So to begin, I will give you a brief introduction of Pew and the work we do within our environment portfolio. And then I will go ahead and transition us to a Blue Carbon 101. And then lastly, we will end with efforts underway in Oregon to conserve blue carbon habitats. So we have tailored this presentation to be very place-based, and we hope you come away with a new sense of appreciation for Oregon's coasts. All right, so the Pew Charitable Trust is a global non-governmental organization funded in 1948 by the Pew family. Pew began as an anonymous grant-making organization, and in 2002, it became a public charity. This gave Pew more flexibility to engage in new initiatives and operate programs for maximum effectiveness and efficiency. So our mission is to apply rigorous analytical approach to improve public policy and inform the public, and as well as invigorate civic life. So we achieve our goals with these values as our foundation. First, nonpartisanship. We follow our commitment to pursue common goals, bridge divides, and build a shared path to success. We are fact-based, so we approach issues with a thorough analysis of the underlying problem and possible solutions. We pride ourselves on being result-oriented, so we design our projects with rigor and evaluate them regularly so that we can course correct if need be to achieve tangible results. And lastly, we have recently made a commitment to include inclusion, diversity, and equity into our work, and we're undergoing a process to integrate these values throughout our organization. All right, so today we work on a broad array of issues, both internationally and nationally. We have a large environment portfolio, and our other initiatives also include consumer policy, such as home financing, healthcare, such as dental care access, and broadband access. So really the common thread across our initiatives is that we seek to educate the public and advance evidence-based policies that address today's most challenging problems. So specifically along the West Coast, our team increases protections for kelp and eelgrass and estuarine habitats. We develop ecosystem-based fisheries management plans for fisheries that have a high bycatch, such as halibut. And in Washington in particularly, we work with partners to prevent seabed mining in the state waters, and we're looking to do the same in California. Lastly, we also work with interested states in incorporating coastal blue carbon habitats into climate mitigation strategies. So within each campaign, we play various roles that include providing technical expertise on policy development. We also advocate. We fund research to address management questions or fill any data gaps. And we implement communication, outreach, and education, or at times we fund our partners to do so. So really the cool thing about protecting coastal habitats is this huge benefit we get from them, right? So we've been calling this our triple win, and that really results in having measurable carbon sequestration benefits from climate mitigation. We also get enhanced coastal resilience. So this would be reducing impacts of climate change such as storms and flooding on coastlines. And this improves our adaptation. And lastly, of course, the protection of biodiversity, which is crucial. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into blue carbon. So you may be wondering, what exactly is blue carbon and how can it help combat climate change? So carbon is the building block of life, and it's a crucial component of all living organisms. So much like the hydrologic or water cycle, carbon moves through the biosphere and can be stored or released through a suite of geochemical, physical, and biological processes. So when we refer to the term blue carbon, what we simply mean is carbon being stored or removed by coastal and marine ecosystems. The term can really be broken down into two distinct categories. And the first one is coastal blue carbon, which describes that carbon found in that narrow part where land meets sea. And this would be mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. Of course, seagrasses are a little tricky because they are submerged aquatic vegetation, but I will go ahead and elaborate why they fit into this category in the coming slides. And then secondly, we have oceanic blue carbon, and this is the carbon accounted for through the actions of marine life. So this would be like the inputs and outputs of algae or the whale carcasses that fall to the deep sea, contributing to those deep ocean reservoirs. So historically, terrestrial forested ecosystems have been looked at as the largest carbon sink. However, recent assessments have shown that coastal wetlands, while small in area, sequester substantially more greenhouse gases per acre than forested ecosystems. And because of its incredible efficiency, they have the potential to act as nature-based tools for mitigating climate change. All right, so now we'll go into how carbon is captured and stored by these ecosystems. So two things to know while you're looking at this diagram. First, we have 3 types of coastal blue carbon habitats represented here, but please do your best to ignore mangroves because as awesome as they are, we do not have mangrove ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. Second thing to note is that carbon sequestered is being shown here by these blue spheres. So throughout the process of photosynthesis, plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use that carbon to support growth of new leaves, stems, and roots. So over time, plants shed those leaves or perhaps die, adding to that rich sediment layer below. And in that way, they lock away that carbon that makes up their biomass. So what differentiates these habitats from terrestrial forests is the presence of seawater, which fluctuates with the tides, and on this diagram is depicted by that dashed blue line. So with the ebb and flow of tides, sediments become saturated, resulting in very low oxygen conditions that slow the decay of plant matter. So this occurs because in oxygen-poor sediments, there are fewer organisms that can break down the organic matter. So essentially, carbon is being readily stored into the system without being reintroduced back into the cycle by decomposers. So you can see that because of these unique characteristics, healthy coastal ecosystems are exceedingly good at storing away carbon for millennia and provide a natural way to prevent it from being released into the atmosphere where it can contribute to climate change. Right, so the capacity for these ecosystems to act as carbon sinks has launched them to the forefront of climate policy efforts. So in 2013, the climate contribution of coastal blue carbon habitats was recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or otherwise known as IPCC. So the fact that IPCC developed an accounting protocol is an important step forward because once a standardized methodology becomes available, both national and subnational governments can work on developing carbon inventories for countries or their specific states. So in order to be integrated into climate mitigation policies, managers must first demonstrate that coastal or oceanic ecosystems meet this criteria below. So first, they must show that there's a presence of high carbon stocks. So in other words, showing that an abundance of carbon is being held within that system. They should also have evidence of long-term carbon storage, which implies that the carbon is not being readily released back into the system through physical or biological processes like decomposition. And third, it should be accessible to measure and monitor for greenhouse gas exchanges. So meaning that researchers and stakeholders can come back to those sites to continue gathering data on greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So once all these factors are taken into account, only a subset of these environments qualify as actionable for climate change solutions. So here on the screen, we have 3 coastal habitats that meet the actionable criteria because they hold significant carbon stocks, accumulate sediment that can be measured for carbon fluxes, and are close to the shore, which facilitates mapping and long-term monitoring. So lucky for us, 2 out of those 3 habitats exist in the state of Oregon, making our state a prime target for inclusion as a nature-based solution for climate change. So in the top left-hand side, I want to bring your attention to Oregon's forested tidal wetlands, which have been called out as a vital carbon sink for our state. And Bobby will chat a little bit more about this later on. And in the top right-hand side, we have eelgrass beds, which are also a crucial sink, but are in dire need of additional mapping data and inclusion into the state's carbon inventory, which they're presently not a part of. So thus far, we've talked about coastal blue carbon, and we have kind of ignored oceanic blue carbon, but oceanic blue carbon is also a crucial carbon sink. However, unlike its coastal counterpart, it does not yet meet the criteria to be recognized by the IPCC, making it difficult for states to integrate it into their climate goals. So the reason it's not integrated, even though it does sequester carbon, it's because it's challenging to quantify those carbon stocks and monitor them over time. The challenge here is really the large distribution and remote locations of these habitats. So really, you can imagine the difficulty in measuring whale carcasses falling to the deep sea, or the work involved in taking sediment cores in the deep ocean. Of course, as new developments in technology emerge, their designation might change. And here we have a prime example of oceanic blue carbon. And let's be honest, no presentation in the West Coast would be complete without a mention to kelp. So we know that macroalgal systems are extensive and highly productive. Kelp forests cover 26% of the world's coast, and there is evidence that they contribute to long-term carbon burial. So from this diagram, you can observe how this occurs. Kelp takes up carbon via photosynthesis, but unlike coastal marshes or seagrasses, kelp does not accrete sediment in the underlying canopy because it grows in these rocky wave-washed areas. It does, however, become unattached from those rocks during storms or through ocean currents and floats out to sea, where it eventually sinks or donates its carbon to deep sea sediments. Or as studies have suggested, other blue carbon habitats also have get carbon donated from kelp. And these habitats could be like eelgrass beds. So besides carbon sequestration, kelp forests are amazing ecosystem engineers, which support biodiversity, provide protection from coastal erosion, and reduce the localized effects of ocean acidification. So with all these accolades, you may be wondering again, why are they not included as actionable blue carbon habitats, or why do they not have an IPCC recognition? Again, the truth is that while there's currently a lot of buzz around algae, it remains difficult to map due to its irregular distribution or patchy distribution. And it's also difficult to quantify those carbon sites where it donates its carbon to. So that being said, it's not impossible. And there are many assessments underway to use new technologies like environmental DNA to trace the fate of kelp in the ocean. So lastly, I want to leave you with a final word on why we care about blue carbon. So from our short time together, you most likely have gathered that there is an underlying theme to our presentation, and that is attempting to reduce planet warming greenhouse gases by using natural ecosystems. Now, I want to make clear that the best way to address the climate crisis is really to curb our emissions, but I also want to emphasize that if we don't preserve coastal and marine habitats, we run the risk of accelerating climate change. Coastal habitats still hold very valuable carbon stocks, and more they're being degraded from pollution and diking, as well as conversion to agriculture. So as all these disturbances continue, not only are we reducing carbon sequestration benefits, which help mitigate climate change, but we are also depriving communities from the ability to adapt to the effects of a warming planet. So when we put our heads together to protect and restore these habitats, we can reap the wealth of services that make coasts productive and resilient. So finally, here is a complete list of ecosystem services that Oregon receives from coastal and marine habitats. First and foremost, they balance the carbon cycle through carbon dioxide sequestration. They also provide critical breeding and nursing and feeding habitat for wildlife populations. They act as nurseries to commercially important fisheries like salmon and shellfish. They also improve water quality by removing sediments and pollutants. They preserve culturally important lifeways. They protect coastal towns and cities from storms and flooding by absorbing the water and dampening wave energy. They provide outdoor recreations for all those recreation junkies, and they also bolster tourism industry. And they boost natural resource and habitat restoration jobs, so it's good economic opportunity there. And lastly, they promote education and scientific inquiry. So with that, I will hand it off to my colleague Bobby to talk more about the efforts underway in Oregon for policy.
Thanks, Jasmine, very much. And thanks everybody at Friends of Haystack Rock and Friends of Cape Falcon Marine Reserve for having us this evening. My name is Bobby Hayden, as mentioned, and I have lived and worked in Oregon since the late 90s. My wife was born and raised on the Oregon's north coast in Seaside, and so our family has a real love for the Oregon coast. And I live and work in Portland, and I've been with Pew for the past 6 years. Again, very grateful to speak to you tonight. So for the next couple minutes, I am going to cover how Pew and others are working to make blue carbon count. That is really how these habitats, including our beloved Oregon coast, can play a meaningful and quantifiable role in how we act on climate. Later, I'll get to some initial thoughts on how Friends of Haystack Rock and Friends of Cape Falcon could potentially get involved. Next slide, please, Jasmine. Around the globe, Pew and other partners definitely are working to build partnerships with nations to help them integrate coastal wetlands into their climate plans and emissions reductions commitments, what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. These are really the commitments that nations are making. Most of this so far for us has come in the form of helping to connect science and scientists with policy and policymakers. And again, as you see here on the slide, there's several nations around the globe that are going big on blue carbon in particular, and that's Belize and the Seychelles, Costa Rica. And then here in the States, Pew and others are currently engaged in Oregon, hello Oregon, California, and North Carolina. And then locally, it's a little bit tangential, but it's very much related. The Lincoln County, Newport area are about to undertake, in the state, the Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development are about to undergo updating Oregon's estuary management plans, which they're essentially land use plans for Oregon's estuaries. These plans were quite visionary when they were crafted about 40 years ago, but that was 40 years ago. And we've learned a lot about estuaries and their importance, as Jasmine has highlighted earlier. Also, the EMPs did not involve coastal tribal nations at the time, nor did they address past uses and degradation of the estuary. So we also think that, in addition to the blue carbon policy track that I'll get to in a second, we also think that this estuary management plan update is a really great potential place to think about blue carbon and protecting these blue carbon habitats into the future. Next slide, please. So at the state level, I come bringing good news about climate, which is sometimes hard to get these days. Last year, Governor Brown issued an executive order here in Oregon that includes a whole host of climate actions, basically charging different state agencies to make meaningful climate action plans. And this included charging Oregon's Global Warming Commission with adopting, as Jasmine mentioned, the first ever for the state, natural and working lands carbon sequestration proposal. And now, historically, when folks hear natural and working lands, that's mostly meant our farms and our terrestrial forests. But we are proud, Pew is proud, and working with partners, that we played in a role in helping to expand this opportunity to include coastal wetlands. And the way we did that is highlighted here on the slide. We worked with several partners. Silvestrum Climate Solutions, they are a world-renowned research firm that does blue carbon accounting all over the globe. They've worked with the EPA and others. The Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, which includes a lot of great scientists and researchers from around the Northwest. And then perhaps most importantly, the Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development was a partner in this as well, specifically their Oregon Coastal Management Program. So it's great that the state is looking to expand this opportunity into the blue carbon world. Next slide, please, Jasmine. So the issue also of blue carbon also received, as part of this process that the state has undergone over the last year, has received a lot of broad-based support from local, coastal, statewide groups. Several groups came to testify along the way in 2021. And I think the commission, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, really came away with a sense of how this impacts people who are concerned about climate action, coastal resilience, protecting our salmon, our seabirds, protecting cultural resources, and other recreationally, commercially, and ecologically important species, as well as the way they interconnect with coastal communities and how we prepare for sea level rise and other issues facing the coast. And to their credit, the commission really engaged tribes and landowners and managers, different state agencies, and all total, they said they heard from over 1,000 individuals and organizations. So next slide, please. So in terms of what's actually in the proposal, which was voted on August 4th and became kind of official in early September, is a whole host of really cool stuff. The first is an outcome-based goal, which is basically the core of the proposal that really calls on the state of Oregon to sequester at least, and I'm going to throw some numbers at you, at least 5 million metric tons of CO2 per year in Oregon's natural working lands and waters by 2030, and then at least 9.5 million metric tons by 2050. And this is, they called upon the state to have this be in addition to Oregon's existing climate goals. So this is plus some, which is great. And so in terms of crunching those numbers, that really means that first goal by 2030 would be the equivalent of over 1 million passenger vehicles, their emissions for a year, or the equivalent of energy usage of over 600,000 homes. And then this goal by 2050, if we are able to hit it, would basically double that. So that's the numbers. And then this is where it gets really interesting, that the commission really called upon the governor and the legislature and state agencies to really come up with activity-based metrics. And so that's math on the ground and in the water. Like, how do we quantify real protections, either conservation or restoration goals relative to making these habitats survive and thrive into the future? Additionally, there's community-based metrics. So how do we better quantify and incorporate other benefits to the community? Like, as Jasmine mentioned, a lot of these habitats protect us against sea level rise. That should be accounted for. Riding along the community piece is environmental justice. I think the state of Oregon is making a renewed commitment to that. And so the commission asked that whatever moves forward really follow the recommendations and the frameworks from the Environmental Justice Task Force and the Racial Justice Council. So with all of that, for the purposes of this conversation, this is they kind of went big on the blue carbon side too, and that's specifically around tidal wetlands, which I'll get to a little bit more in a second. They also recognize the importance of the need for more data around eelgrass and kelp. You're seeing a theme from Jasmine and from Eyes. Like, they really want to, regardless of the fact that we can't really quantify them or make them count towards the IPCC's goal, the commission really identified that kelp and eelgrass are super important and we should include them in some way. And then lastly, they called for the formation of an actual Natural and Working Lands Council to really synthesize and help move the ball forward here. Next slide. So I'm going to dive into the one of tidal wetlands, tidal swamps, as they're called on this slide. I stole this from Dr. Laura Brophy. I'm going to tip my hat to her a couple times probably in the next minute or so. So one area that the commission really highlighted was forested tidal wetlands. And tucked into you may have missed it in Jasmine's words, but these habitats on Oregon's coast store more carbon per acre than any other type of habitat in the world. And that's why I added this slide at the last minute, because somebody recently was like, is that really true? Did you really say that? And it actually is true. And that's highlighted in this graph. And afterwards we can send a link around to participants to a lot of these, information, including this study. But if you look around globally, this is biggest bang for the buck is in these forested tidal wetlands that have Sitka spruce, for folks that know that habitat type. I mentioned Dr. Laura Brophy. Her and others at the Institute of Applied Ecology and elsewhere have really done a lot of great work over the years. And I think she actually gave a talk last year to the Lower Nehalem Community Trust, which was a really good presentation. Next slide, please. So just to keep on this theme, some fast facts here about forested tidal wetlands. This is a picture of the Siuslaw. Every 1,000 acres of this restored is the equivalent of emissions from 50,000 cars in a year. These types of habitats are critical for salmon and steelhead. As the slide indicates, we've lost about 95% of this habitat due to past land use practices, but it also has really high potential for recovery and for restoration. And again, tip my hat to Laura Brophy, who's led a lot of this work. Next slide, please. Here's Nehalem Bay, right near you all. This is a forested tidal wetland, tidal swamp. Enough said. Next slide. So in terms of where this issue heads next, the ball really is in the governor and the legislature's court. There's plenty that the governor could do. New strategies to protect and restore blue carbon, avoiding further loss of these habitats, allowing for inland migration for these habitats given sea level rise. And as mentioned, there's still data and science gaps that need to be filled. And so part of the advocacy really is like, we need a little bit more science here. And in addition to where the blue carbon issue goes on the policy front, I think it's definitely time for the collective we to really begin determining what financial options and financial tools are available and needed in order to make this huge climate opportunity a reality on the ground, on the coast of Oregon. And this really boils down to a lot of different sovereigns and stakeholders working together, tribal nations, working with farmers and foresters and bankers to really think through how to make this meaningful and how to really protect these critical habitats into the future. Again, there's a lot of details to figure out here, but that nothing should preclude the governor and others from really taking the commission's proposal and starting to run with it. Next slide. So in terms of how you can help, climate change and its impacts can leave all of us, definitely me included, sometimes feeling a little helpless as to how to act. But I do think when we act collectively, we can achieve a whole lot. And if you've taken anything away from this presentation, I hope that it includes the notion that Oregon's coast and its people and its habitats have a huge role to play in climate solutions. A couple options here, and I can post these links when I'm done gabbing at you. I can post these links in the chat. Contact our governor. This coming Monday, it's a long meeting, it's 1 to 5, but they're covering a lot. The Oregon Global Warming Commission is, and right around 4 o'clock hour is when they take public comment. You can sign up for our newsletter here. Again, I'll post these links. And then in terms of partnerships, Friends of Haystack Rock and Friends of Cape Falcon, I know you folks might be connected already with these groups, but I just did want to highlight the Oregon Kelp Alliance. They're doing a lot of really great work around the question of kelp and protecting kelp into the future here in Oregon, as well as the Alaka Alliance, really cool initiative to to consider how what options we need and what habitats we need and how to pull people together to potentially reintroduce otters to the Oregon coast, which is very cool. And again, just to stay in touch, we'd be happy to hear from you directly, and we'd be happy to hear from you right now if there are any questions we could answer. Thank you very much for taking the time tonight.
Thank you, Bobby and Jasmine. We do have a couple questions. The first one comes from Elizabeth Collins, and she is wanting to know your thoughts on wave energy and is concerned about the negative impacts on habitat.
Yeah,
I can give that one a go, Jasmine. If,
am I on mute? The question again was regarding wave energy.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Bobby, if you want to go ahead, or I can go ahead as well.
Go ahead, Jasmine. Yeah.
Yeah. So dampening wave energy. So storms get stronger and intensify with climate change. These coastal habitats and wetlands can really dampen a lot of that energy as it comes in. So if you can imagine, they act almost as a barrier, taking on a lot of that wave energy before it hits land. So in that way, they're really providing that coastal ecosystem service. It also helps prevent erosion, right? We have been having a big problem with eroding beaches along the coast. So having those ecosystems there really distribute that energy so that coastal erosion is not as big of a problem. And even though when storms are intensifying, they can take some of that, they can buffer some of that energy as it's coming in. Yeah. And sorry, there was a second part to that question, but I missed it.
It was the negative impacts on the habitat.
So that impacts they can have in the habitat, wave energy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So as I said, it can, as storms intensify, these habitats can become eroded over time, and so that is definitely not good because you're losing that whole habitat as well. And then Bobby, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think so. If I'm getting the question right, I think it's about wave energy as in the technology. I think I'm not sure. I think so, because this has been an emerging issue on Oregon's coast. To be quite frank, I have not followed the latest on wave energy, and standing here today, or I'm sitting here, Pew is not really working in that space, and so we don't really have I don't really have a well thought out response, honestly. But I know that the state is really looking into wave energy as like Oregon as a hub for research around wave energy, not necessarily implementing it here writ large. That's just me off the cuff. The last I had really checked in on the wave energy issue. But again, it's not an issue that Pew or our team has a particular take on. So that's a long-winded, I'm not so sure answer to your question. So apologies.
So our next question comes from Joe Leibowitz, and his question is, if the natural working lands proposal moves forward, how exactly would it be implemented and matrix tracked so we know goals are being accomplished?
Bobby, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. Boy, it's a really great question. Thank you for the question, Joe. I think it's a little unclear at this stage. I think it sort of depends on if the proposal, like the implementation of the proposal, really rests with the governor and through executive action, essentially tasking agencies to really implement a lot of the things. I do understand that there's quite a bit in there that would require legislative action, and so it really depends on where the issue rests. But there's ways, I think there's multiple agencies that are already in the conversation that will play a meaningful role. I know that Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development is looking closely at this. I think there's ways that OWEB could play a role, but the quantification, at this stage, it's so early. All of what we said about how this is, the blue carbon stuff is really measurable and quantifiable, is absolutely the case. But I think what hasn't come yet is kind of the Oregon DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, and other types of regulatory agencies in states around the country. It's so new that I think they're not quite there yet in incorporating this into their regulatory math around climate. But I think that could potentially be a next step as well. Also, the Oregon Department of Energy is really looking at this in terms of their role in climate action, and it looks to be it's a really wonky track, but it's something that they've been working on. Actually, this is what we'll hear from the Oregon Department of Energy on Monday at the Oregon Global Warming Commission. We'll hear a little bit more about their plans. But one of the things that I think is interesting for this crowd and this issue area is that they are going to be looking at how co-benefits of different actions to sequester carbon. What are the co-benefits of that? So, and again, that gets back to one of the earlier slides about, like, should we protect this area or conserve this area because it reduces greenhouse gases and it also protects salmon, or it helps protect us from sea level rise, right? Like, really trying to factor those in. And so I think it's the Oregon Department of Energy could be on a really interesting track on that front. So I'll leave it at that.
Just
go ahead,
as
Jasmine.
Bobby's thoughts on the science front as well. We definitely need more data. So some of these environments, as I mentioned, have been inventoried, but we are missing a whole other environments like seagrass meadows or eelgrass here in the state of Oregon. So those have not been inventoried yet. So in order for implementation to happen, we also need to have those numbers. So yeah, I just want to say that more data is necessary as well.
Great. Okay, so our next question comes from Nadia Gardner. And she is saying, on the North Oregon coast, we have Haystack Rock, a marine garden, and Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. What role might marine protection areas like these play in carbon mitigation?
Great, I can go ahead and take that. First, it really just goes to the core of definition. Marine protected areas are protecting those areas, and they're protecting, they have catch limits. So in that sense, they are basically containing those ecosystem services. And they, without, if you're not degrading that ecosystem or developing it, then you're definitely reaping those carbon benefits. But like I said, a whole host of other ecosystem benefits. So protecting those areas is really crucial to prevent degradation or development. So in that sense, they can really contribute to carbon sequestration, because leaving those habitats intact, you really get the whole host and suite of benefits from them.
Okay, so our next question is from Margaret.
Sorry, real quick, I just wanted, it made me, the question from Nadia made me want to also add to Jasmine's piece about the Nature Conservancy. TNC, it's my understanding TNC in Oregon is taking a really closer look at blue carbon in the marine space as well. And so I think just to shout them out as like another potential partner here in the mix to really potentially help us think through how what is the relationship between blue carbon sequestering greenhouse gases and our infrastructure of marine reserves now and into the future.
So then our next question comes from Margaret Treadwell. For those working on tidal wetland and Sitka spruce swamp conservation and restoration, how far away are we from the state's recognition of the importance of blue carbon leading to additional funding sources for this work?
I think I'll take this one. Crystal ball. I think. Well, I'll talk about this week. This week is COP26, which is the Council of the Parties. This is, as folks may know, is the global conference where nations come together and are really working towards, hopefully, some real commitments on climate. Our governor, Governor Kate Brown, is there, and there's been a lot of great commitments that have come out even in the last week and last couple of days from the governor. Governor's signed on to a couple things that around ocean acidification, which has been a key issue for the governor and for the state of Oregon and for the whole West Coast. And so I guess not to take your question, Margaret, to like the 30,000 foot level, but I think I'm broadly optimistic that this is gonna start to mean something on the ground for new tools, as I think you're kind of pointing to, new conservation tools, new funding streams, and that sort of thing. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this could start rolling in the next couple years. But again, it really I think it hinges upon these next steps. I think the commission has really done its job to create the platform here via the Natural and Working Lands proposal, and now it's kind of up to the governor and the legislature and others to see, make it meaningful.
Great. So then our next question comes from Carla Cole. Is there any work being done at the legislative level to better protect the few small pocket Sitka spruce wetlands that are left?
I can take that one as well. I don't know. I will say, to be honest, and I will say, Pew is not really engaged at the legislative level on this issue or other issues in Oregon. So we frankly don't track the legislature that much. So I can't really speak to it.
Fair enough. So then we have a couple follow-up questions from Joe Leibowitz. How do you think the blue carbon sequestration efforts in Oregon will inform the upcoming efforts to update Oregon's estuary management plans?
Well, I think I'll take this one too. I'm really hopeful that it will. I think I feel like I'm answering everything with like it depends, but I think if there is meaningful action from and next steps from the governor or say the legislature, I think that changes the conversation on the ground in the places that the questioner is talking about in the Yaquina Estuary Management Plan, for example. So I think there might be, as I mentioned, the estuary management plans are basically they're land use plans, and so if we as a state are having a new conversation about like, how do we really track and better quantify and then better manage these coastal wetlands, these coastal habitats because of carbon, because of all the co-benefits, then I think it does change the conversation about like, in estuary management plans, like, do we decide to create new new uses or new types of management within those estuaries because we're carving out space, or we're talking to farmers and saying like, your land is not, it's not, you can't grow because the sea level rise, saltwater intrusion is a real thing. Like, what options do you have for your family farm? If you're able to gain, if there are funding streams wherein that farmer is able to essentially farm carbon, which is a emerging conversation, then I think that changes the conversation a little bit. And so that's the kind of thing that I am hopeful, and I think others are hopeful, the conversation that I think can and should be happening within the context of, as Joe mentioned, these Oregon Estuary Management Plan updates, and in this larger blue carbon conversation, policy conversation in Oregon.
Sorry, and I think that is going to lead into our next question, also by Joe. He says, Bobby mentioned that there is a lot of promise in restoring the tidal forested wetlands. If there is so little left, does that mean creating new tidal forested wetlands, converting existing habitats, or just restoring the little that is left?
I'll take this one too. So I'm not a scientist, I'm not a specialist in this field, but from what I can gather, the reason that there is one of the many reasons that to focus on these forested tidal wetlands is their restoration potential. So in other words, I mean, for folks who practice it, and I don't, but restoration is really hard, and it's hard to get right. But from everything I've read and the conversations we've had with managers and researchers and whatnot, is that the potential to restore these forested tidal wetlands is there in a more meaningful way than say other habitat types.
And then I think our last question comes from Angela Benton. First, she wants to thank you both. She really enjoyed your talk. She found it very interesting. Her question is, what are the current biggest threats to kelp and eelgrass? How significant is the impact of sea urchins on kelp forests?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take that. So the biggest impact to kelp and seagrass is really climate change. So with warming waters, I'm sure you've heard, kelp really suffers because it really needs that surge of cold, nutrient-rich waters. So of course, climate change really increases the temperature of the ocean, and so that is definitely bad for kelp and eelgrass. However, there are other more localized, I would say, stressors that add to the decline of kelp or eelgrass, and those are like pollutants coming in, so eutrophication from nearshore habitats, as well as over-harvesting, which could be an issue. As far as urchins, I might have Bobby talk a little bit more about the work that's being done through the Pew side in Oregon to protect kelp. But as far as urchins, yes. So kelp, you get these kelp beds, and the decline of kelp. So as soon as kelp goes away, because it has this growth phase, right? So if the budding kelp, I guess I would call it, as it's growing, if it's not growing fast enough at the rate, like urchins can definitely overtake that. And if it's not coming back, urchin populations grow, and they can just continuously feed on that kelp, and sometimes they continuously feed even if that kelp is very low to the ground. So urchins are a big problem, and as I have heard, and I'm kind of new to the West Coast region, so they're spreading along the West Coast. So it started really bad in California, and now we're seeing that problem intensify in Oregon and Washington as well. So those local stressors are definitely adding to the decline of kelp. So those are some of the biggest issues facing kelp and eelgrass right now.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. I would add just again, and I posted it in the chat, but not everybody's a participant in the Zoom. So I'll just say the Oregon Kelp Alliance has done a lot of, it is emerging and doing a lot of great work on this front. And they are OregonKelp.com. And I would definitely refer to them.
And I'll post all of the links on our Facebook site. So you folks watching, if you want to go ahead and take a look at that as soon as we're done here, I'll go ahead and put those in the comment section. Bobby, Jasmine, Kristen, thank you so much. It was a really great presentation. Thank you guys all for watching too. You had very thoughtful, good questions. Kristen, is there anything you want to add on the end? Good, because you're still on mute.
Sorry. No, just thank you so much for joining us. And actually I do. If you're interested, we have a celebration, a virtual celebration coming up. Please check out our Facebook page. And other than that, thank you so much for sticking around for the talk. Thanks, Bobby and Jasmine.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks, Tiffany. Be well.